I want to share with you some statistics just to kind of shock and awe you, hopefully, so you can see how just belief that there is a God in general is dropping rapidly in our country. These are some statistics that were put together and released last summer in July 2023 from a Gallup poll. Take a look at this. They reported that belief in God among Americans has dropped from 90% in 2001 to 74% in 2023. So just think about that for a moment. There was only 1 in 10 who would say that there is no God, describe themselves as an atheist, agnostic. But now we're talking about 1 in 4 in 2023. Probably the scarier statistic is the next one, and it's among the younger ages. Look at that. We're approaching 50-50. And this is just belief in God. This has nothing to do with Christianity. This is just that there is some sort of higher power, some sort of ultimate being. And so this first step is becoming more and more pertinent, and that's why we spent 5 weeks. I think it's good to be familiar with the reasons that we believe that there is a God. And so we went through those arguments in a lot of depth. But I think, especially at the start of each lecture, I gave a simplified version of those arguments. And that's relatively easy to remember, some of those simplified arguments. And so when I'm in a conversation, I can run through some of those main arguments for God in just a few minutes. They're pretty basic. First cause arguments, design arguments. The moral argument might be a little bit more technical, but it's good to be familiar with those. By the way, these were the arguments then, families of arguments that we looked at. And we made some conclusions. This is usually how it works when we put together these arguments for the existence of God. We use something called abductive reasoning to make some conclusions. Because as you remember, even with the first cause argument, it didn't end with the existence of God. It ended with just there being a cause, a first cause of the universe in that case, that particular one we looked at. But first cause arguments usually end up with the conclusion that there is a first cause. But we can use abductive reasoning to make some reasonable conclusions about what this first cause must be like. And so we put together a list of attributes, and these are conclusions that really thinkers from around the world and throughout history have come to independently, that there is a supreme being that generally has these sort of characteristics. And I'll just, as a reminder, go through and refresh our minds on how we came to these conclusions. So from first cause arguments, since the universe had a beginning, there must be a cause beyond the universe, right? And if the universe just is nature, that's what we call the universe, nature. If you're a naturalist, you believe that all that there is the physical material universe. So if this first cause is the cause of the universe, it would make sense, and even the astronomers that we looked at said this, that this first cause, it seems reasonable to conclude that it is beyond nature. It is super nature, supernatural. Since the universe just is space, time, and matter, that's what the universe is made up of, space, time, and matter, whatever caused the universe must be beyond that, or before. The first cause came before space, before time, before matter existed. So it's reasonable to conclude this first cause is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. If it brought the universe into existence from nothingness, not a vacuum, not space, nothing, then I think it's reasonable to conclude this first cause is extremely powerful and, by definition, a creator. From design arguments, we can see that the universe shows has some very telling characteristics that it has been designed. Very fine-tuned constants of the universe. And we've just never seen design come from any other source than an intelligent mind. Maybe it's possible for design to come some other way, but we've just never seen it. And so it seems reasonable to conclude, since our universe shows signs of design, that this first cause is some sort of an intelligent mind. And then lastly, from moral arguments, because we discover here in this reality we exist in, love and morality, such an important part of reality, I think it's reasonable to conclude that this first cause, this supreme being, if you want to use that term, is the source of love and morality. If it's the ultimate source of morality, it seems reasonable that this first cause is morally perfect. And because morality has to do with persons, right? Non-persons don't seem to interact in the moral realm. Morality specifically seems to have to do with persons being good or bad to other people. You being a person, a non-person, doesn't really seem to be able to do anything good or bad, right or wrong. So morality is definitely has to do with persons. It's a personal experience, a personal thing that we encounter. It seems reasonable to conclude that the source of morality, this first cause, is also personal. So as I've said, separate thinkers, different cultures throughout history and around the world have come to a similar conclusion that there is a supreme being that has these sort of characteristics. And this isn't a coincidence. It's not a coincidence because all of these different thinkers independently arrived at this conclusion through a similar thought process. As they looked around at the world and their experience, their moral experience, and looked around at the universe, studied things, they came to this conclusion by thinking rationally, reasonably, logically through these issues. And so that's why you find these arguments all around the world and throughout history. First cause arguments, design arguments, and moral arguments. Because it's the similar thought process as to how these folks came to this conclusion. Now, a great book which summarizes a lot of this is Does God Exist? This is a book which will document for you what I just keep saying, that you can find these arguments all around the world throughout history. This book actually documents it. And so you can see different cultures, different thinkers from different places throughout history coming to these same conclusions through these type of arguments as they come up with them independently. Let's look at some examples as we're doing kind of a transitionary lecture today. I want to point out some of these examples of arguments for God throughout history and around the world. We've got several examples in the early Greek philosophers. I'll just go through some of the most famous ones. So you've got Socrates. He argued that the world seemed providentially designed by a vastly knowledgeable and powerful being. And to make his case, he would use very simple things. He would point to even our eyelashes and our eyebrows seem to have been designed for the purpose of shielding our eyes. And as I mentioned before, this is the case of even polytheistic belief systems. So even within a belief system that believed in many gods, they would usually have one ultimate God that created all the others. So we could even put them in this category of believing in a supreme ultimate being. All right, Plato has several arguments for the existence of God. A very interesting one, and he's known for his Platonic forms. But in his thought process, he viewed the world around him and noticed that everything here is in flux, right? Everything is constantly changing. Our bodies are changing, the rivers are changing, the weather is changing. This realm, this physical realm, doesn't seem to be a firm enough foundation for absolute truth, because everything here is changing. And so he posited that there must be another realm where absolute objective truth comes from, and had a very elaborate story, a very elaborate explanation about how that transcendent truth from that transcendent realm can get down into us, can get down here into this physical realm that's always in flux, that's always changing. But the early church fathers, like Saint Augustine, he was very impressed with Plato. And St. Augustine, for example, said that Plato, even though he didn't realize it, when he talked about this transcendent realm, was actually describing the mind and nature of God. And so just from general revelation, Plato was able to come up with some remarkable, correct conclusions about this transcendent realm that ultimate truth, objective, absolute truth must come from. Plato also argued for a divine being from the order of the motion of the stars and of all the things under the dominion of the mind which ordered the universe. So again, you see here a conclusion that this supreme being must be some sort of an intelligent mind, a best soul who's the maker and father of all, the king who ordered the primordial chaos into the rational cosmos that we observe today. Of course, Aristotle as well. He has that famous unmoved mover argument. Now, these folks didn't use the term God, obviously. We'll get into that later, where that term God came from. But in their Greek language, they would use the word Theos, where we get the term theology from, Theos. But it's important not just to get hung up on the different names that people would use for the idea of a supreme being. It's important instead to focus on how they described this supreme being they believed in. So in Aristotle's case, he described this supreme being, Theos in his language, as living, intelligent, incorporeal, eternal, and a most good being, the source of order in the cosmos. So and I'm just giving you the highlights of ancient Greek philosophers, the most famous ones. There were many, many Greek thinkers who concluded that there must be a supreme being. We have a very interesting situation in Acts 17, where Paul is actually interacting with some of these Greek philosophers. So in this conversation, we see Paul talking with Greek philosophers who believe in a supreme being. And he starts his conversation. It's very, very interesting. We're going to look more at Acts 17 later, more towards the end of this lecture. But just to put a bug in your ear right now, in this conversation that Paul has with these Greek philosophers, he points out to them that they are correct in believing that there is a supreme being. In fact, Paul quotes two of their own Greek authors to make the point that, yay, you guys are correct. There is a supreme being out there. Going back to some of these ideas from Greek philosophers, how they came to this conclusion through general revelation that there must be a supreme being, Paul agrees with them. He says, you guys are right. In fact, your own Greek poets have said these things about God, and you guys are correct. There is a supreme being. Interestingly enough, then, Paul goes on to explain that some of their beliefs about this supreme being are incorrect, and he lovingly, gently, I would say respectfully, points out where they're wrong in their thinking about this supreme being, but he does agree with them that they're correct in thinking that there is an ultimate supreme being out there, and uses some of their own authors to make the point that they were correct in thinking that.